Hello, accountants and academics. My name is TB Sky, and today, well, you already know what we're doing today because it's on the screen, and you read it. So, I get a lot of comments on my videos asking me to do lists of things, whether it's best ADCs, worst Yordles, coolest designs, whatever it may be. And I'm always hesitant because I would really rather do full videos on the individual designs than quick videos like list videos. But on the other hand, there is like 140 characters in League of Legends, and I have other stuff I want to talk about, and inevitably some of them are going to get reworked before I have a chance to talk about what's wrong with them or how it might be fixed. And I would really like to talk about some of the stuff that's wrong with some of the characters in League of Legends because I think it's very interesting. It's a field of study that I'm curious about. So, in the interest of time, we're going to be doing this as a list. But before we get into it, let's define a few terms. First of all, this is going to be a relatively subjective list. As indeed, all criticism is. It's based very much on how I approach these things. And if one of the champions I mentioned on this list happens to be your favorite, the one you love playing more than anything else, whose design really speaks to you, I'm not here to tell you that you're stupid or that you're wrong or that you're not allowed to enjoy it anymore. I'm just here to say I have these reservations, I have these reasons, and this rationale for believing that the character design is weak. So what does a weak character design mean? Well, for me, the big thing is whether or not the character design actually executes on its own premise, like whether it communicates to the person observing it the feelings, emotions, and understanding that its concept, its design, its lore, its backstory says that it should. Another aspect, which I hesitate to call it originality, because that's not really what it is, but something along the lines of being an original twist on an idea, because no ideas are really original, and Kindred is a great example of this, because personifying death is old hat. Like, thousands of people have done it before. It's been done for thousands of years, indeed, and having a character composed of two disparate aspects is not a new idea either, but mashing those two things together, that's kind of new, and mashing that together with an idea of death as a hunter, and then embodying that aspect of the hunter in characters like a lamb and a wolf, that's it's something that's made of unoriginal parts, but which comes together in an original way, and that's going to be one of the criteria from which I'm going to be judging these designs. Finally, this is not a ranked video. This is not a matter of number 10 being the least worst and number 1 being the absolute worst of all champion designs ever. It's a chronological list. I'm going to start with the old champions, and I'm going to work my way up to the new ones. So keep that in mind also as we finally get into it with Master Yi. Now, Master Yi and the 4 first champions, indeed, on this list launched alongside League of Legends back in the day. They launched with the game back when it was pretty much a Dota clone, and back long before it had any kind of unifying, thought-through aesthetic. Like, Ionia as a region was barely really a thought in the designers' heads at that point. Like, what exactly was going on with the various aesthetics was not really a part of the game yet. They hadn't really come together to figure that stuff out. And hoo boy does it show. Master Yi is, in short, a mess. He's at once supposed to embody the stereotype of the Asian kung fu master, sort of, but he's also kind of a samurai, except he's also sort of a ninja. But he's not actually very based on Japanese aesthetics, except for some of his armor, but then his robes look kind of more along the Chinese lines. He's a mishmash of a whole bunch of different things that don't really work together very well. His sword, with the 2 rings on it, I think is an homage to a particular type of Chinese weapon. But then he's got these curved blades on his legs, which we're going to come back to, which look to be more designed along the lines of a scimitar or something like that. So kind of weird, odd design, but the absolute weirdest thing about him is the fact that he wears a Splinter Cell helmet, which I believe in the old lore, like in the long ago times, it was supposed to help him see aspects of Wuju energy or something like that. It was supposed to give him some kind of special sight, but that never really came across in either his, his in-game abilities and powers, and it also never really came across in anything to do with his lore. And the result is someone who's kind of a mishmash of a whole bunch of weird tropes that don't really go together in any kind of cohesive way, and which certainly doesn't really line up with anything in the current Ionian aesthetic. He's basically just kind of slapped together mess that doesn't really make sense for the role that he's supposed to occupy, especially given that his current primary lore connection is as a wise sensei to Wukong, which is it's a neat idea, but again, the aspect of being a sensei, a teacher, a master, that's not really in his character design at all. And yeah, he's not a fantastic design. I look forward to the day when he's finally properly given a visual update for the second time. It's probably going to be some years before they get around to it. And the trouble with these old champions, as indeed we shall see, is that some of them are so iconic to League of Legends that you kind of can't change them. Even if they're not great designs, they have stuck around for so long, they have acquired so much meaning that it would do a lot more harm than good to fundamentally rework them. Second design we're looking at is perhaps not a surprise to anyone. Nunu. Nunu is, and I don't let this flashy, splashy new splash art fool you, Nunu is terrible. He's just terrible. His in-game character model is possibly the worst in the entire game. It's this weirdly distorted, cartoony, freakishly Warcraft 3 looking, god-awful mess of a thing. But the problems with Nunu go further than just his character model is kind of ugly. It's also a problem of how they're executing on the premise. Now, the basic premise of Nunu, like when you get right down to it, is the idea of a small child and a big scary monster. Essentially the same premise that spawned Annie, who's a substantially better execution of that idea. Nunu and Willump, by the way, is the Yeti's name. A lot of people think the Yeti is named Nunu because the child sitting on Willump's back, for a lot of people, doesn't really register that much as part of the character, and I can't say I blame them, and we're going to get to that. I'm excited for his rework, by the way. That was one of the things that spurred me to make this video, is because I kind of want to discuss some of the stuff that's wrong with Nunu before his rework hits, and he probably becomes a lot better. The core of their relationship is one of symbiosis. It's one of two people who care for each other and who help each other out and who are friends and partners on the long road of life. That's supposed to be who they are. In the lore, as it stands right now, I believe the story is that Nunu the boy saves Willump the Yeti from some cruel members of Sejuani's tribe who are keeping him as a pet or as some kind of performing animal, working animal, something like that. Nunu takes pity on Willump, gives him food, helps him escape, and they become good friends and they help each other out along the way and become kind of famous in their own right. That's a really interesting idea, but when you look at Nunu's character design, especially the way that he appears in game or indeed in older splash arts, Nunu himself isn't really that much a part of the character. The majority of the character's real estate, the majority of their action, their behavior, the way they move, the way they interact with the world is defined by Willump. It's defined by the Yeti. He's the one who does all the stuff. To the point where all Nunu really does is sit on his back and throw snowballs. Magic snowballs, which he can throw for some reason. And I think it's also supposed to be Nunu who casts Blood Boil. Which, okay, but that implies that the kid is actually a mage or a sorcerer of some kind. And that, too, doesn't come across from his design at all. Indeed, insofar as you can even see his design, because it's always so freaking obscured by Nunu. Or by Willump, rather. See, now I'm doing it. Nunu himself is barely a character in Nunu, and that's really the fundamental trouble, is that there's not an equality of importance between two members of what's supposed to be a duo of equal friends. Which is, that was the whole point of Nunu, is that he's the only one who sees Willump as an equal and a person, and someone who's, worthy of respect and kindness and love. So they're supposed to be equals in that sense, and it just doesn't work, plus it's ugly as hell. So, Morgana. There's a lot wrong with Morgana, and the biggest thing is not the fact that she's walking around in a bra for some reason. That's really, that's stupid too, but that's not really the biggest problem. The biggest problem is what she's supposed to be. Because Morgana is tightly connected with Kayle, who I was halfway tempted to put on the list alongside Morgana, but ultimately Kayle is actually a really good execution of the idea of an avenging angel, of this sort of faceless soldier of heaven who visits judgment on, the sinful mortals. Like, Kayle is a really good execution of that, but Morgana is a really bad execution of a fallen angel. The only aspect of her that really at all says that she has anything to do with corrupted divinity is her corrupted wings, her dark wings, which are sort of ragged and torn apart. But that is kind of that idea is good, but none of it is carried through to the rest of her. She doesn't wear like tattered rags or old pieces of armor that looks like Kale's armor to denote that there is any kind of connection between them. Kale and her have no aesthetic connection whatsoever. Like, not the way they dress, not even really the look of their wings, which are just generic angel wings. And Morgana herself, despite her wings being all torn apart, seems to be none the worse for wear for having fallen, like for being a fallen angel, for being a corrupted demon kind of thing. She just kind of looks like a hot lady with elf ears for some reason. Kale doesn't have elf ears, by the way. That's Morgana has those. Because she's evil, I guess. And there's she doesn't have any scars, she doesn't have any burns, she doesn't seem to have been damaged at all in her fall, except her wings are ugly now. Except they're still incredibly badass and not repulsive in any way. So it's the idea that she's supposed to represent the mirror image of Kale, like this ugly, corrupted underside of what Kale is supposed to be, that doesn't really come across. And on the other hand, in some of the lore, certainly the lore state she had before the current retcons that are going on, Morgana was kind of cast as this rebel against authority, someone who chafed under the fascistic authority of Kale's people, who were just like these hyper-judgmental, just completely inflexible assholes, essentially. And Morgana decided to fall on purpose and fight for freedom. Except nothing about her says anti-authoritarian either. Like, there's no... What would have been really cool would be if Kale represents this very tight, buttoned-up, polished, nice breast armor, respect for authority, kind of old-fashioned conservative authoritarianism. If Morgana represented something more like a punk vision of what that might be, like an anarchist, a punk, some kind of leather-clad crazy person, like who chafes against authority, who sticks it to the man, but that's not really in there either. Instead, she just... The only counterpoint she really has to Kale is that Kale is wearing a full suit of armor, and Morgana is not wearing a full suit of armor. In fact, she's just wearing a bra on her upper body and the world's biggest skirt on her lower body, which again, it's not really a compelling contrast. Like, so if Morgana's concept is supposed to be this inversion of what Kale is supposed to stand for, none of it works. It just does not fit together at all. Now, here's one I think I'm going to get some pushback on, because Ryze is a popular champion. I mean, he's a very beloved champion and a really important champion to League of Legends. He's a huge part of how League of Legends looks and the history of the game. He's someone who's iconic to the game. It's just such a shame that he's not very interesting. To me, that's kind of the issue with Ryze, is that he's super generic. Like, you could put him in World of Warcraft right now, and I don't think anyone would really bat an eyelash, because that's what that is. And again, it's because he's an old champion. He was designed at a time when League of Legends took most of its visual cues from a Warcraft 3 mod. So it makes sense that he's kind of Warcraft 3-ish, but with him specifically, none of that has ever really reached beyond that to reach for something that was kind of unique to League of Legends. He looks painfully generic across pretty much all fantasy genres, to the point where I could put him in most modern fantasy games, and I don't think people would bat that much of an eyelash either. There's also the issue that Ryze's lore, for a good long while now, has been essentially that he's this ancient, sort of burdened with great destiny or a great task, kind of self-flagellating martyr who's traveling around the world gathering up this powerful magic, these runes, to trap them so that they can't be used again to try and destroy the world. But in terms of him being a scholar, an academic, or indeed a world traveler, or some kind of pained messiah, like, you could do stuff with some chains to signify the weight of his burden. You could do some stuff with, just give him a pair of glasses, or, you know, make the book a more important part of how he, the books and the scrolls and the pages, more important part of how he interacts with the world. Like, this, all these little things I feel like could be done to make him fit the mold of that self-punishing martyr who's trying to save the world from its own hubris. Like, that aspect is not super greatly communicated. Now, Ryze is not the weakest champion in League of Legends in terms of character design, but he's weak enough and he's old enough that I felt like he kind of belonged on this list, because yeah, he's not terrible, but not terrible is not a super high bar to clear. So, Pantheon. Or should I say, random extra from the 300 movie who got lost and wandered onto a video game, and now he can't find his way back out again. If Rise is somewhat generic to fantasy, then Pantheon is painfully generic to pretty much everything. Pantheon is... he's just an extra from 300. Like, I really can't... There's nowhere to engage with him, or nowhere to approach his design that doesn't end up with, yeah, he looks like he's from 300. Because that's what he is, but he also looks like he might be in God of War, or he might be from one of the Total War games, or like literally any other video game that involves any kind of sort of Greco-Roman hoplite aesthetic, that he just does not look like anything. He looks like the generic model that you buy on the Unity asset store in order to modify it into something that you can use in your own game. Like, he's so painfully nothing. And even worse, like, it literally looks like the movie 300 is happening in the background of his splash art, and he's in front of this weird Greco-Roman temple, which, again, doesn't fit into the aesthetics of Targon. It doesn't fit into the aesthetics of League of Legends as a whole, and he doesn't even look like, in the lore of the game right now, he's the aspect of war, like the very embodiment, the very divine embodiment of what war is supposed to look like. And what does war look like? A dude with a shield and a spear. That's the very embodiment of the soul of war, is one dude with a shield and spear and big pizza feet. It's just, it's hard to say much about Pantheon because all of it eventually just comes back to he's generic and boring. LeBlanc. Now, LeBlanc, there's actually a really interesting concept at work here. There's actually a very good idea at work here, because LeBlanc is dressed like a tacky Las Vegas stage magician. Like, that's what that outfit is about. That's why the cape, that's why the headpiece, that's why the weird string bikini thing, whatever the hell that is, however the hell that stays on her body. I think it's glued on there. Look how close it just clings to her. That's what's going on here. She's supposed to represent the stage magician, the grand illusionist, the person who deceives the crowd with all of their great magic, and that concept is really interesting. But the execution is just kind of... I'm not... Because LeBlanc's nature, remember, is that she's this ageless entity that was once a sorceress who fought Mordekaiser back in the day, and who helped clear the immortal bastion upon which Noxus is now built. So she's literally, in a sense, one of the founders of Noxus as a whole, but nothing about her really says Noxian, particularly. And again, it's because she's kind of old and Noxus has progressed as an aesthetic entity since she was released, but nothing about her really says Noxus. Whether she's the face of Noxus or the underbelly of Noxus, it's not really that much of a connection. She's gold and purple when Noxus tends towards the black, gray, and red color palette, and so she's kind of unconnected there. But that, of course, makes sense in a certain degree because she's just an image, she's an illusion, she's a projection. And there, too, I feel like you could do a lot better, because in order for a lie to be compelling, like in order for it to, at least for me, if I'm going to play as someone whose job it is to deceive and trick and you know, undermine enemies, the thing I would want is to be let in on the truth. Like, in order to tell a lie, you have to know what's true first, right? And for me, LeBlanc is someone where I would always have really liked that if, as the player, you play as her actual form, like who she actually looks like underneath all of that illusion. And the thing is, when it comes to deception, when it comes to secrets and you know, subterfuge, there's a lot of visual symbology that exists in the world that we have used for a very long time to convey these things, and usually it comes down to cover up. Essentially, cover your face with a mask or a hood, cover your body with, you know, shapeless clothing that doesn't reveal who you are underneath, cover yourself in shadow, cover yourself in darkness. All of this is the common language of subterfuge, whereas the common language of openness and honesty is to be exposed, to have an exposed chest, an exposed broad face, like where you can see all the features. Like, that's the visual coding for honesty. And LeBlanc kind of, she's sort of ish coded more towards like she's open and honest because she's exposed, but on the other hand, she's also so clearly fake and stage managed that you kind of don't buy it. And that's also the problem with LeBlanc, is that she's so obviously fake. Like her design, like I said, she's designed to look like a Las Vegas stage magician, and that's not. To me, it would be more compelling if she was designed not to look like that. A little bit, like weirdly a little bit. But the thing I mostly want, the idea I've always had in my head is that when you play as LeBlanc, if you could play as the real LeBlanc behind the illusion, and that you alone, as the player, would be able to see a little flicker where her projected perfect stage magician image kind of flickers a little bit, and you can see the real person underneath, who looks much more sinister and kind of covered up and maybe even kind of ugly, because she's this parasitic entity that has traveled from person to person for hundreds of years. Like, there's a lot more you can do with the lore that LeBlanc is supposed to embody than just tacky stage magician, which is where she is right now. Caitlyn. Caitlyn. Yeah. Caitlyn is on this list because Ashe isn't, essentially. I did a video about Ashe previously where I talked about why her character design is kind of terrible, which is why I'm not including her or Serath on this list. But Caitlyn is the other one who frustrates me a lot, because for multiple reasons. First of all, in the lore, Caitlyn is the Piltover sheriff. She is the chief officer of the law. She's the prime member of the Piltover police force. She's the detective. She's the sheriff. She's in charge, and that's what the lore tells us about her, is that she's someone whose parents were, I think, abducted. I'm not sure. They retconned some part of it with the Piltover lore update, and I'm not 100% sure what it says in detail right now, but essentially she's someone who has been investigating criminals for a long time, who took an early interest in criminology and in stopping crime and catching thieves, and that's been her primary motivation throughout all her life, was to be an excellent investigator, someone who could chase down criminals, right wrongs, do good. And her character design, on the other hand, is steampunk cosplayer with a big-ass gun. And the trouble is, she used to be supposed to be the sniper of League of Legends, and that kind of works with the sort of careful, deliberate sort of investigator. You predict where your opponent is going to go by investigating them thoroughly and knowing their movements, and then you snipe them with a headshot. Like, that kind of makes sense. But the sniper of League of Legends now is Jhin. He very much took over her slot, and Caitlyn herself has been left in kind of a odd position where her gameplay encourages you to shoot as many times as possible in order to get her passive to crit, and her ultimate is just kind of a targeted spell that you don't plan for it, you don't set it up, you don't execute on it carefully, you just kind of fire it off. And like, her kit kind of doesn't jive with her lore, and indeed her design doesn't. She's supposed to be the kind of children of Piltover nobility, and if you take a look at characters like Camille, you know what Piltover nobility is supposed to be like. These uptight aristocrats in opposition to the punky aesthetic of Son. These are the authority figures, the aristocrats, the uptight, bastards on the top of the ladder, the one percenters. And Caitlyn is supposed to represent the authority of these people, the authority of the state, the authority of the government as a primary law enforcement officer. But she doesn't look like the officer of anything. She just doesn't wear anything that could be identified as a uniform. She doesn't carry any tools that are associated with crime fighting. No handcuffs, no fingerprint powder, no nothing. Like, there's no indications that is her profession. When you look at her, my first impression of Caitlyn every time I see her is that she is some kind of Victorian trophy hunter. Like, that's the design it looks like they went for. Someone who, like, travels around and hunts the greatest game of all, which is man. Like, that she's indeed villainous, by the way. That's a lot of the darker purples and the stuff that's going on with Caitlyn and the big-ass gun being a sniper. All of that is more closely associated with villainy than it is with law enforcement, being the keeper of the peace. And so Caitlyn is just this kind of... Again, she's an old design, but she has always, from the day she was made, been a bit of a mismatch. Because you have someone who's supposed to be the chief law enforcement officer of an aristocratic metropolis, but no part of her looks like it. None of it. Just 0.zilch parts of her look like it. In fact, the number of redesigns I've seen of Caitlyn is astonishing, and pretty much every single one of them agrees that she should be wearing some kind of buttoned-up jacket that looks official and perhaps a little bit more masculine, which in some ways is kind of a pity, because you really everybody agrees she needs to look more authoritative in order to be a sheriff, and she just, at the moment, doesn't. She looks dangerous, but not like authority. Saira. Oh yes, Saira. Essentially, the trouble with Saira is that she's a Poison Ivy cover band. That's really, for me, what it boils down to, is that she's Poison Ivy, except we don't have the rights to Poison Ivy, so we're just gonna make up this design that's slightly different enough that we don't get sued, but she's still Poison Ivy, essentially. And that's very much part of how she's presented as well. For me, that's kind of a... like, it's not like it's terrible. She's fine. She's okay. But for me, when I look at her, I just see wasted potential. Because the idea of a plant that disguises itself in human form is really compelling as an idea. Because it's something that's very much associated with plants already. Like, there's a reason Poison Ivy is associated with seduction, is because plants have seduction techniques kind of built into their biology. If you think of Venus flytraps, or indeed those sac flowers that hang on trees that the Bellsprout from Pokemon is based on, where they lure insects inside them with the smell of nectar, and then the insect falls into their digestive juices and can't get out because all the walls are slippery. Like, entrapment and seduction and, you know, essentially cheating of prey, or just flowers that attract bees with their nectar in order to help them spread their pollen. Like, all of that stuff lends itself well to a creature of seduction, but Saira kind of isn't really that. Like, she's sexy, but this aspect of this is not a human. This is a plant that is taking an alluring form in order to draw you in and use you as compost, essentially, is not really well communicated with her. For my money, what I would have really liked to see with Saira is something that is recognizably not human. Like, something that moves like a non-human creature that's pretending to be a human. Something that, like, she, for instance, like, if she moved in completely weird floppy ways that she could twist her whole body 360 degrees around on her spine, because she doesn't have a spine, because she's plant matter that's kind of stretching inside a human puppet that's kind of operating her like an awkward robot would. Like, that's something that looks uncanny valley, that looks human enough to fool someone, maybe, but which is also just profoundly wrong, sort of profoundly repulsive and scary. But what we have instead is Poison Ivy cosplayer, sexy lady with some leaves on, and that to me has honestly always been kind of a disappointment. Aatrox. Again, people are probably not super surprised to see him on this list. Aatrox is kind of a weak design. He's the first of the Darkin, a race of creatures that has become increasingly important to League of Legends as Riot have struggled their way towards making them into a more workable concept. And as far as I remember his original conception, he was supposed to be this grand demon of war. This again, an embodiment of war in the same way that Pantheon is, who was so steeped in blood and power that he managed to corrupt Tryndamere towards his own ends by turning Tryndamere into a, you know, blood-crazed villain who struggles to contain his rage. That used to be part of him. I think that has been retconned out of him. And indeed, back when he was launched, it was not even really a thing that the Darkin were the weapons yet, which is what it is now. Now the Darkin is the weapon. Anyone who grabs a Darkin weapon runs the risk of being corrupted by that weapon and turned into the demonic form that we see here today. And with a character like Kayn, or indeed even with characters like Varys, that makes a little bit more sense, because they look more like recognizably mortal human creatures that have grabbed a corrupting weapon and thus been changed. But Aatrox, he just looks like a demon, is the thing. He just looks like a demon from hell, who's a demon from hell. And there's not really any interesting aesthetic touches to him. Like, he's a demon from hell who wears a lot of metal on him, and there's a lot of spikes going on, and he has these big crimson dark wings and a big serrated sword, but it's like Pantheon, like Rise, it's super generic, and it doesn't really have anything interesting to say. And because Aatrox was designed before it became clear that the weapon is supposed to be the primary character, I think that's part of why he ends up being so unfocused, whereas someone like Kayn and Rast are characters with, like, real personality to them. Rast in particular, even as a scythe, has that glowing eye that sits in the middle of it, like, that really gives it a sense of life, a sense of being a living weapon. But with Aatrox, it's just a sword with some edges on it, but there's no sense that this is a living creature. There's no sense that this thing could reach out, essentially. It's no sense that it could speak, and that's kind of what a Darkin needs in order for the weapon to be compelling. It's also the problem that Varys kind of still has, because he was retconned into being a Darkin. The weapon still doesn't look compellingly like a living entity. It really doesn't compellingly look like anything more than just a really fucked up looking bow. But Varys is overall still a stronger design, hence Aatrox's place on this list, which leads us to our final entrant. And if you follow my YouTube channel for a while, this is going to come as no surprise to you. KAISA. I have laid out my issues with KAISA's character designs multiple times in a couple of different videos. There's going to be links to those down in the description, so if you want my full breakdown of why I don't like this character design, you can go and watch it there. For the purposes of this video, I will keep it brief. KAISA is a child who was thrown into a hostile hell dimension and left to fend for herself. In order to survive, she literally had to bond herself to one of the amoral Cthulhu-like hell creatures that occupy this nether dimension and turn it into a weapon for herself. And at the end of all of her struggles and all of her trials, all of this desperate, terrifying trauma, what we get is a sexy cosplay Instagram model in a lycra bodysuit with some cool props, who has not visibly suffered any hardship ever in their lives, who is not emaciated, who doesn't look especially powerful, who doesn't look especially paranoid or terrified or angry, who doesn't really express much of anything, who's just kind of there, looking like a cheap Kerrigan knockoff, with not much to really recommend her, and a whole lot of cleavage for reasons that kind of pass understanding. I'm gonna end it there, but I could talk about KAISA forever. And I probably should not do that. If you've enjoyed this video, I'm very happy. Thank you very much for watching through to the end. It ended up being over half an hour long. But if you'd like to prevent me from ever doing a video like this ever again, you can head over to Patreon and support at any level that you're able to, and you get to vote on some future video topics. At the moment, we're choosing between a video where I try to analyze Dark Souls boss character designs while also fighting them, a video that breaks down the history of the Yordles in League of Legends and kind of discusses why they are the way they are and what they're kind of supposed to represent in that universe, and one that discusses the character design of Metal Gears, that is, the Metal Gear robots in Metal Gear, and what those successive generations of robot designs say about the franchise. If you don't particularly want to support this channel on Patreon, that is 100,000,000% completely fine. I'm just so happy that anyone does, and indeed you can see a scrolling list of all of their names out there on the left. Thank you very much to all of you. Now, there is a like button down below, which you are encouraged to click on if you so desire, and there's also a there's a dislike button, but I probably shouldn't bring this up, but he's been drinking a lot recently, and it's gotten really bad. And we think the thing that's really set him off is because he's been clicked on too much, and he just can't take it. Like, his psyche is too weak. So we'd really appreciate that. We're staging an intervention next month, so if you need to click on the dislike button, if you could just wait until then we and his entire family will be very grateful, because we are going through a very trying time. You can also leave some comments down below, and you can subscribe if you are so inclined. My name has been TBSky. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video.